In the hushed corridors of Windsor Castle, two small figures stood before mirrors that had reflected the faces of monarchs for centuries. 9-year-old Prince George adjusted his black tie with trembling fingers, while 7-year-old Princess Charlotte smoothed down her dark coat dress. Neither child fully understood that they were about to become part of history itself, walking behind the coffin of the only great-grandmother they had ever known, in front of 2 billion watching eyes. The queen who had taught them to wave from palace balconies, who had shared secret jokes during family gatherings, and who had patiently explained the weight of duty that would one day rest upon their young shoulders, was taking her final journey home. As the golden carriage carrying her coffin began its solemn procession through the streets of London, these two children, barely tall enough to see over the crowds, would demonstrate a composure and grace that would move the world to tears. This is the story of that extraordinary day when childhood innocence met ancient ceremony, and two young royals showed a grieving nation what courage looks like in its smallest forms. The morning of September 19th, 2022, dawned crisp and clear over Windsor Castle, but inside the ancient walls, an unusual silence had settled like a heavy blanket. Prince George sat at the edge of his bed, his small hands folded in his lap, staring at the black suit that had been carefully laid out for him the night before. At 9 years old, he had worn many formal outfits, but none had carried the weight that this one did. Down the hall, Princess Charlotte was having her hair braided by her nanny, Maria Teresa Turian-Barallo. The 7-year-old princess had been unusually quiet since waking up, occasionally asking questions that showed she was trying to process something far beyond her years. "Will Gon be cold?" she had whispered earlier, using the pet name the royal children had for their great-grandmother. The question had brought tears to her mother's eyes, though Catherine had quickly composed herself. The Prince and Princess of Wales had spent weeks preparing their children for this day. William had sat George down in his study, the same room where his own father had explained difficult truths to him decades earlier. "Your great-grandmother has gone to be with great-grandpa Philip," William had said gently, his voice steady despite the emotion threatening to break through. "And today we're going to say goodbye to her properly, the way our family has always done." George had nodded solemnly, his young mind grappling with the concept of finality. He understood death in the way that children do, as something that happened, but not necessarily as something permanent. The Queen had always been there, a constant presence in his life like the sun or the Thames. The idea that she simply wouldn't be anymore was difficult for his 9-year-old mind to fully grasp. Catherine had taken a different approach with Charlotte, sitting with her daughter in the nursery, surrounded by familiar toys and books. "Do you remember the stories Gon used to tell us about the castle?" she had asked. Charlotte had nodded eagerly, her eyes brightening at the memory of the Queen's animated tales about the long-dead kings and queens whose portraits lined the corridor walls. "Well," Catherine had continued, "now Gon gets to meet all those people she told us about. But before she goes to see them, we need to show her how much we love her one more time." Charlotte had processed this information with the seriousness that had always marked her personality, even as a toddler. She was the one who would correct her older brother when he forgot to bow to their great-grandmother, the one who remembered to say please and thank you without being prompted. The decision to include George and Charlotte in the funeral procession hadn't been made lightly. Palace officials had debated for days about whether it was appropriate to subject such young children to the intense public scrutiny and emotional weight of the occasion. Previous royal funerals had typically excluded children, seen as too vulnerable and unpredictable for such solemn state occasions. But William and Catherine had been adamant. They loved her, William had said during one particularly intense meeting in the private secretary's office. She loved them. They need to be able to say goodbye. He had paused, thinking of his own experiences with death and ceremony. They're stronger than people think they are. The Queen herself had expressed wishes about her great-grandchildren's involvement in her final farewell during her later years. She had often spoken about the importance of family continuity, of ensuring that even the youngest members of the royal family understood their roles and responsibilities. "The children must learn," she had said to her private secretary during one of their weekly audiences. "Not just about duty, but about love, about loss, about what it means to serve something greater than yourself." As the morning progressed, both children underwent the kind of preparation that had become routine for them, yet felt entirely different given the circumstances. Their clothes had been chosen with meticulous care, black, of course, but cut in styles that acknowledged their youth while maintaining appropriate formality. George's suit was a smaller version of what his father would wear, complete with a black tie that he was still learning to knot properly. Charlotte's coat dress was elegant, but practical, with buttons she could manage herself and a hemline that would allow her to walk comfortably for the long distance they would cover. The protocol team had spent hours working out the logistics of including the children in the procession. How fast could they realistically walk? How long could they maintain composure? What would happen if one of them became overwhelmed? Contingency plans were drawn up, discrete exit strategies mapped out, and additional security measures put in place to shield them from the most intense media scrutiny. But perhaps the most important preparation was happening on a much more personal level. The night before the funeral, the family had gathered in the private sitting room at Windsor Castle. No cameras, no staff beyond the absolute essential, just parents, children, and grandfather. Charles had taken his grandchildren onto his lap, something he didn't do often enough in the rush of royal duties, and simply talked to them about their great-grandmother. "She was very proud of you both," he had said, his voice softer than usual. "She used to tell me about the pictures you drew for her, George, and how you would practice your curtsies, Charlotte. She kept everything you made for her in a special box in her private study." George had perked up at this information. "Really? Even a wonky horse I drew?" Charles had laughed, the first genuine laugh any of them had shared in days. "Especially the wonky horse." She said it had character. Charlotte had been more practical in her questions. "Will there be lots of people watching us tomorrow, Grandpapa?" Charles had nodded honestly. "More people than you can imagine, darling. But here's a secret your great-grandmother taught me when I was young. You don't have to look at all of them. Just pick one person in the crowd who looks kind and wave to them. They'll wave back, and suddenly, all those people become just one person who's happy to see you." The advice was vintage Elizabeth, practical, wise, and delivered with the kind of gentle humor that had endeared her to her family, even as she maintained the formality required by her position. It was exactly the sort of guidance she had given to William when he was George's age, walking behind his mother's coffin in 1997. The Queen had understood then, as she understood now, that children need concrete strategies for navigating overwhelming situations. As the morning routine continued, both children seemed to absorb the gravity of the day through the behavior of the adults around them. The usual cheerful chatter of the nursery staff was subdued. Their parents moved with a careful deliberateness that the children recognized from other important occasions, but amplified. Even the family spaniel, Orla, seemed to sense the solemnity, staying close to the children rather than racing around as she usually did. The breakfast was simple but carefully chosen, foods that were unlikely to cause any digestive upset during what would be a very long day. George ate mechanically, his mind clearly elsewhere, while Charlotte picked at her food and asked periodic questions about the day ahead. "Will we see Mama and Papa during the walking?" she wanted to know. "Will there be singing like at church?" Each question was answered honestly, but gently, with William and Catherine working together to provide information without overwhelming their children with too many details. They had learned from experience that both George and Charlotte coped better with preparation than with surprises, but that too much information could be as problematic as too little. The final touch came as they prepared to leave for London. Catherine produced two small items that had belonged to the Queen, a handkerchief that Elizabeth had carried on her own wedding day for Charlotte, and a pair of cufflinks that had belonged to George VI for George. "These are for you to carry today," she explained. "So Gone can be close to you, even when she's not here anymore." Both children handled these precious objects with the reverence they might show to crown jewels, understanding instinctively that they were being trusted with something irreplaceable. George carefully tucked the cufflinks into his jacket pocket, while Charlotte held the delicate lace handkerchief as if it were made of spun gold. As their car pulled away from Windsor Castle toward London, both children pressed their faces to the windows, watching the familiar countryside roll past. Neither of them spoke much during the journey, but Charlotte reached over and took her brother's hand, a gesture of mutual support that would be captured by photographers later in the day and would touch hearts around the world. The weight of what lay ahead seemed to settle over all of them as they drove through increasingly crowded streets toward Westminster Abbey. Soon, they would step out of the protective bubble of family and into the full glare of global attention, two small figures in a vast historical moment, carrying themselves with a dignity that would honor both their great-grandmother's memory and their own emerging understanding of duty. The motorcade approached Westminster Abbey through streets that seemed to pulse with an almost electric silence. George and Charlotte peered through the darkened windows at crowds that stretched as far as their young eyes could see, faces turned toward their approaching cars with expressions of reverence and curiosity. The usual sounds of London, traffic, construction, the general hum of urban life, had been replaced by something unprecedented, the quiet murmur of 2 million people united in grief and respect. As their car drew closer to the Abbey, Charlotte squeezed her brother's hand tighter. "There are so many people," she whispered, her 7-year-old voice tinged with awe rather than fear. George nodded, trying to process the scale of what he was seeing. He had been to many public events before, had waved from palace balconies to crowds below, but nothing had prepared him for this. Streets packed so densely with people that they seemed to form a living carpet stretching to the horizon. Their parents sat opposite them in the car, William's hand resting protectively on Catherine's, both of them monitoring their children's reactions with the careful attention of parents who understood they were about to ask something extraordinary of their young family. "Remember what Grandpapa told you," Catherine said softly. "Find one kind face in the crowd, and everything else becomes easier." The car pulled up to the great west door of Westminster Abbey, and suddenly the abstract concept of many people watching became viscerally real. Cameras clicked like mechanical rainfall, their flashes creating a strobe effect even in the morning daylight. Security personnel formed a protective corridor, their black-suited figures creating a buffer between the royal family and the intense media scrutiny. George stepped out first, his young frame straightening automatically into the posture he had been taught since he could walk, shoulders back, chin up, hands at his sides. The weight of hundreds of cameras focusing on him was almost physical, but he had been prepared for this moment. His parents had spent hours helping him practice walking slowly and deliberately, explaining that on this day, every step needed to be measured and respectful. Charlotte emerged from the car with the natural grace that had marked her public appearances since she was barely able to walk. Even at 7, she had an intuitive understanding of ceremony that sometimes surprised the adults around her. She automatically smoothed her coat dress and checked that her small black hat was sitting properly, details that might seem trivial but spoke to her developing sense of occasion and propriety. The family moved as a unit toward the Abbey entrance, their steps synchronized in a way that came from years of public appearances together. But today felt different. There was no cheerful waving, no bright smiles for the cameras. Instead, both children maintained expressions of serious composure that seemed far too mature for their ages, yet somehow exactly right for the moment. Inside Westminster Abbey, the atmosphere struck them immediately. The ancient stones seemed to absorb sound differently today, creating a hushed reverence that was almost sacred in its intensity. Charlotte's eyes widened as she took in the packed pews, row upon row of world leaders, heads of state, representatives from every corner of the globe, all gathered to honor her great-grandmother. The sight was overwhelming in its scope and dignity. George walked beside his sister, occasionally glancing up at the soaring Gothic arches above them. He had been in the Abbey before, but never when it was filled with such concentrated grief and respect. The building itself seemed to understand the gravity of the moment, its ancient walls bearing witness to another chapter in the long story of British monarchy. Their great-grandmother's coffin sat at the front of the abbey, draped in the royal standard and topped with the imperial state crown, the orb, and the scepter. To most of the congregation, these were symbols of monarchy and state power. To George and Charlotte, they were simply things that belonged to gone, precious objects they had seen her wear and carried during their brief but meaningful time with her. The service itself unfolded with the measured pace of centuries-old tradition, but both children remained remarkably attentive throughout. Charlotte followed along in her service booklet, her finger tracing the words she could read and listening carefully to the ones she couldn't yet pronounce. George stood when prompted, bowed his head during prayers, and maintained the kind of focus that would have challenged many adults during such a lengthy and emotionally charged ceremony. Archbishop of Canterbury Justin Welby's words resonated through the abbey with particular power when he spoke of the Queen's devotion to family and duty. She was joyful, present to so many, touching a multitude of lives, he said, his voice carrying to every corner of the vast space. George and Charlotte listened to these words about their great-grandmother with the special attention children give to stories about people they love. When the congregation sang, "The Lord's My Shepherd," Charlotte's small voice could be heard joining in, her clear treble adding to the massive choir of voices that filled the abbey. She had learned this hymn at the small chapel services the family attended at Sandringham, and singing it now created a bridge between those intimate family moments and this grand public farewell. The most poignant moment came during the 2-minute silence that concluded the service. In a building packed with over 2,000 people, the quiet was so complete it seemed to have weight. George and Charlotte stood perfectly still, their small figures somehow commanding as much respect as any of the world leaders surrounding them. In that moment, they represented not just the future of the monarchy, but the personal love of a family, saying goodbye to someone irreplaceable. As the service concluded and the procession began to form for the journey to Wellington Arch, both children demonstrated the kind of composure that would be remarked upon by observers worldwide. They waited patiently while the complex choreography of a state funeral organized itself around them, remaining calm despite the emotional intensity and logistical complexity of the moment. The pallbearers lifted the Queen's coffin with ceremonial precision, and the royal family began to follow. George and Charlotte took their places in the procession with a natural dignity that spoke to their careful preparation and innate understanding of the importance of the moment. Their parents flanked them protectively, but both children walked independently, their small steps keeping perfect time with the measured pace of the ceremonial guards ahead of them. As they emerged from Westminster Abbey into the London streets, the scale of public attention became almost overwhelming. The crowd stretched in every direction, held back by barriers, but pressing forward with the intensity of collective emotion. People held flowers, photographs of the Queen, and British flags. Many were openly weeping, their grief for a monarch who had been a constant presence in their lives for 7 decades, finding expression in this shared moment of farewell. George and Charlotte handled this extraordinary display of public emotion with remarkable equanimity. They had been prepared for the crowds, but the reality exceeded anything their parents could have described. Yet both children seemed to understand instinctively that they were part of something larger than themselves, participants in a moment that would be remembered and discussed for generations. The walk from Westminster Abbey to Wellington Arch would cover approximately 1 mile, but for 2 young children carrying the weight of royal protocol and international scrutiny, it might as well have been a journey across continents. Every step was measured, every gesture observed and analyzed by millions of viewers around the world. As they began the long walk through central London, both George and Charlotte seemed to find strength in each other's presence. Charlotte occasionally looked up at her brother for reassurance, while George kept a protective eye on his younger sister, ready to offer support if she needed it. Their natural sibling bond provided a foundation of security that helped them navigate this most public and emotionally challenging of moments. The crowds lining the streets showed a remarkable mix of reverence and affection. While the overall atmosphere was one of respectful mourning, there were smiles and gentle waves directed specifically at the two young royals. People seemed to understand that they were witnessing something special, not just a state funeral, but the emergence of a new generation of royals who would carry forward the legacy of service and duty that their great-grandmother had embodied so completely. Behind them walked their parents, grandparents, and extended family, but in many ways, George and Charlotte were walking alone into history, their childhood momentarily set aside to participate in an ancient ceremony of farewell and continuity. They carried themselves with a grace that honored both their great-grandmother's memory and their own developing understanding of what it means to serve something greater than oneself. The funeral procession moved through London's historic streets with the rhythm of a slow heartbeat, each step measured and deliberate. George and Charlotte found themselves walking through neighborhoods that had witnessed centuries of British history, their small figures now part of a pageant that would be remembered alongside the great processions of the past. As they moved along Parliament Street, Charlotte began to notice individual faces in the crowd. Following her grandfather's advice, she focused on one woman near the barrier who was holding a bunch of flowers and smiling through her tears. When Charlotte caught her eye and offered a small, solemn nod of acknowledgement, the woman pressed her hand to her heart and mouthed thank you in return. This simple exchange seemed to transform the overwhelming mass of people into something more manageable for the 7-year-old princess. George, walking beside his sister with the steady gait he had practiced for weeks, found himself thinking about the stories his great-grandmother had told him about London during the war years. She had described walking these same streets during the Blitz when bombs fell around the palace and ordinary people showed extraordinary courage every day. Now he was walking those same streets, surrounded by people who had come to honor the little girl who had grown up to become their queen. The military precision of the procession created a buffer of predictability around the children that helped them maintain their composure. Every 15 seconds, the guards' boots would hit the pavement in perfect unison. Every few minutes, commands would ring out in the clear, carrying voices of the ceremonial units. This rhythm became something the children could rely on, a metronome that helped them keep pace with history itself. Behind the gun carriage carrying the Queen's coffin, the sight of the two young royals walking with such dignity began to capture the attention of television commentators around the world. Remarkable composure from Prince George and Princess Charlotte, noted one BBC presenter, his voice soft with admiration. They represent not just the future of the monarchy, but the personal love of great-grandchildren saying goodbye to someone who clearly meant the world to them. As they passed Downing Street, Charlotte noticed that some people in the crowd were wearing the same mourning colors as her family, while others wore bright clothing that seemed more cheerful. She had asked her mother about this earlier, and Catherine had explained that different people express their feelings in different ways, but that all of them were there because they loved and respected Gone. This understanding helped Charlotte process the variety of emotions she could see on the faces around them. The walk was longer and more physically demanding than anything either child had experienced before. Their formal shoes were comfortable but new, and the measured pace of the procession was actually more tiring than walking normally. George began to feel a slight ache in his legs, but remembered his father's advice about royal duty often requiring physical endurance. Sometimes being royal means doing difficult things because they're important, not because they're easy, William had told him. Halfway through the procession, something unexpected happened that would be captured by photographers and remembered as one of the most touching moments of the day. Charlotte noticed that her brother's tie had shifted slightly in the breeze, and without missing a step or drawing attention to herself, she reached over and gently straightened it for him. The gesture was so natural and loving that it reminded everyone watching that beneath the formal protocol and ancient ceremony, these were simply two children looking after each other during a difficult day. The crowd's response to the children became more emotional as the procession continued. Many people had brought their own children to witness this historic moment, and parents could be seen lifting toddlers onto their shoulders to get a better view of George and Charlotte. The sight of these young witnesses to history seemed to resonate particularly strongly with families in the crowd, who recognized the extraordinary circumstances these children were navigating with such grace. As they approached the historic area around St. James's Palace, both children passed buildings that held special significance in their family's story. George knew that this was where his great-grandmother had lived as a young princess, where she had first learned about the duties that would define her life. Charlotte recognized the palace from family photographs and stories, understanding that they were walking through spaces that connected them to generations of their ancestors. The emotional weight of the moment seemed to intensify as they moved through areas where crowds were particularly dense. Near the mall, people had been waiting since before dawn to secure positions along the route, and their investment in being present for this historic moment created an atmosphere of concentrated attention that was almost palpable. Every step the children took was witnessed by thousands of people and broadcast to millions more around the world. George began to understand, in a way that was new to his 9-year-old consciousness, that this day was about more than just saying goodbye to his great-grandmother. He was participating in something that connected him to centuries of tradition, to a story that was much larger than his individual life, but of which he was now permanently a part. The realization was both humbling and empowering, giving him a sense of purpose that helped him maintain his composure. Charlotte, despite being 2 years younger, seemed to have her own intuitive grasp of the significance of the moment. She had always been observant about the ceremonies and protocols that surrounded royal life, often correcting her brother when he forgot to bow or failed to acknowledge someone properly. Today, her natural attention to detail served her well as she navigated the complex emotions and expectations of this very public farewell. The sight of flowers being thrown gently in front of the procession created moments of unexpected beauty amidst the solemnity. Rose petals, lilies, and small bouquets landed softly on the road ahead of them, creating a carpet of color and fragrance that transformed the austere ceremony into something more personal and touching. Charlotte smiled slightly when she noticed this, understanding that these flowers were expressions of love, not just for the Queen, but for her family. As they walked past Green Park, where thousands more people had gathered to watch the procession on large screens, both children began to understand the true scale of the public response to their great-grandmother's death. The park was filled with people who couldn't get close enough to see the procession directly, but who had come anyway, wanting to be part of this shared moment of national mourning and remembrance. The final approach to Wellington Arch brought new challenges as the crowds became even denser and the emotional intensity reached its peak. People were singing hymns, calling out words of support for the royal family, and openly weeping for a queen who had been a constant presence in their lives for as long as most of them could remember. George and Charlotte maintained their dignity through it all, their small figures somehow commanding as much respect as any of the world leaders in the procession behind them. As Wellington Arch came into view, both children knew that this portion of their long walk was nearly over, but that the day's ceremonies were far from complete. The coffin would be transferred to a hearse here for the final journey to Windsor Castle, where they would participate in a more intimate service before their great-grandmother was laid to rest in St. George's Chapel beside her beloved husband, Prince Philip. The convergence of all these elements, the historic setting, the massive crowds, the global attention, the personal grief, and the ancient protocol, created a moment that transcended ordinary experience. George and Charlotte were no longer just children walking through London. They had become symbols of continuity, representatives of a future that would honor the past, while moving forward into an uncertain but hopeful tomorrow. Their composure and dignity during this most challenging of walks would be remembered as a defining moment, not just in their own young lives, but in the ongoing story of the British monarchy itself. Wellington Arch stood before them like a monument to endurance itself, its classical columns framing the end of their remarkable walk through London. George and Charlotte approached this historic landmark with the same measured dignity they had maintained throughout the procession, though both children were beginning to feel the physical and emotional toll of the morning's events. Their legs were tired from the careful, slow pace they had maintained for over an hour, but their resolve remained unshaken. The moment of transferring the Queen's coffin from the gun carriage to the hearse was choreographed with military precision, yet it carried profound emotional weight for the family watching. Charlotte stood beside her brother, both of them understanding that this marked another stage in their final farewell to their beloved gone. The imperial state crown, the orb, and the scepter were carefully removed from the coffin before it was placed in the hearse, symbols of monarchy that had defined the Queen's public life, but which seemed almost secondary to the personal grief of the family members surrounding them. As the hearse prepared for the journey to Windsor Castle, George and Charlotte joined their parents in one of the following cars. The transition from public procession to private family time was jarring in its contrast. Suddenly, they were no longer performing for the cameras and crowds, but were simply children who had just completed something extraordinarily difficult and were about to face the final goodbye to someone they loved deeply. The drive through the western outskirts of London provided a brief respite from the intensity of the morning, though even this journey was lined with people who had positioned themselves along the route to pay their respects. Villages and towns that the Queen had visited during her long reign turned out to wave farewell as the hearse passed through their communities. Charlotte pressed her face to the window, watching these smaller, more intimate displays of affection and remembrance. George used the quiet time in the car to process what he had just experienced. The scale of the public response had been unlike anything he had previously encountered, and he was beginning to understand that his great-grandmother had meant something profound not just to their family, but to millions of people around the world. The realization was both inspiring and sobering for a 9-year-old who was gradually coming to terms with his own future role in public life. As they approached Windsor Castle, both children perked up noticeably. This was home territory for them, a place where they had countless happy memories of time spent with the Queen in more relaxed, private moments. The castle's familiar towers and walls represented not just royal tradition, but personal comfort, a place where their great-grandmother had been not just the monarch, but simply gone, who told stories and shared jokes and made them feel special and loved. The long walk, the straight avenue that leads to Windsor Castle, was packed with people who had been waiting for hours to witness this final stage of the Queen's journey home. Unlike the formal crowds in London, these gatherings felt more personal and local. Many of these people had lived in Windsor for years, had seen the Queen driving through their community regularly, had felt a personal connection to the monarch who had chosen to make their town her primary residence. The sight of Windsor Castle itself, draped in mourning banners but still magnificent against the autumn sky, brought tears to Charlotte's eyes for the first time that day. This was where she had learned to ride ponies under the Queen's watchful eye, where she had picked flowers in the gardens while her great-grandmother pointed out different varieties and told stories about who had planted them and when. George felt a similar emotional response as familiar landmarks came into view. There was the window of the room where he had once had tea alone with the Queen, just the two of them, while she explained some of the portraits hanging on the walls. There was the garden where they had walked together during his last birthday visit, when she had asked him about school and listened with genuine interest to his answers about mathematics and history. The arrival at Windsor Castle marked the beginning of the final phase of this extraordinary day. The more intimate service at St. George's Chapel would include only family members and a small number of close friends and staff who had served the Queen during her long reign. For George and Charlotte, this represented a transition from public ceremony to private grief, from representing the monarchy to simply being children saying goodbye to their great-grandmother. The chapel itself held deep significance for both children. This was where they had attended family Christmas services, where they had watched their Uncle Harry marry Meghan, where they had celebrated other family milestones in a more relaxed atmosphere than the grand state occasions at Westminster Abbey or St. Paul's Cathedral. The familiar pews and stained glass windows created a sense of intimacy that had been impossible to achieve during the morning's public ceremonies. As the family gathered in the chapel, both children took their seats near their parents, their exhaustion now clearly visible despite their continued composure. The past several hours had required a level of emotional and physical endurance that would have challenged adults, and they had met every expectation with grace and dignity that exceeded their years. The Dean of Windsor's words during this more intimate service focused on the Queen as a person rather than as a monarch, speaking of her love for her family, her sense of humor, her deep faith, and her genuine care for the people she served. These personal reflections resonated particularly strongly with George and Charlotte, who had experienced all of these qualities firsthand during their precious time with their great-grandmother. When the Archbishop of Canterbury spoke about the Queen's legacy living on through her family, both children seemed to understand that he was speaking directly about them, about the responsibility they would carry forward and the example she had set for them to follow. The weight of this inheritance was significant, but their great-grandmother had prepared them for it through her love, her guidance, and her own unwavering example of service and duty. The final hymn, Love Divine, All Loves Excelling, was one that the Queen had chosen personally for the service. As the family sang together in the intimate space of the chapel, Charlotte's clear voice joined with her brother's deeper tones and their parents' more mature harmonies, creating a moment of family unity that transcended the formal requirements of the occasion. The committal service that concluded the chapel ceremony was perhaps the most emotionally challenging moment of the entire day. As the Queen's coffin was lowered into the royal vault, both children said their final farewell to the woman who had been such an important presence in their young lives. Charlotte reached for George's hand, and together they faced this moment of ultimate finality with the same courage they had shown throughout this remarkable day. The crown jewels that had adorned the coffin during the public ceremonies were formally removed and returned to the Tower of London, symbolically marking the end of the Queen's reign and the beginning of a new chapter in the monarchy's long history. For George and Charlotte, this represented not just the end of their great-grandmother's life, but the beginning of their own more conscious participation in the institution she had served so faithfully for 70 years. As the private family time concluded and they prepared to return to their regular routines, both children carried with them the knowledge that they had participated in something historically significant. They had walked through the streets of London, followed by millions of eyes around the world. They had represented their family and their country with dignity that honored both their great-grandmother's memory and their own emerging sense of duty and service. The evening shadows were growing long across Windsor Castle as George and Charlotte finally returned to the private family quarters, their formal funeral attire exchanged for comfortable clothes that felt strange after the day's weighty ceremonies. Both children moved with a subdued quiet that reflected not just physical exhaustion, but the emotional processing of an experience that had fundamentally changed their understanding of themselves and their place in the world. Charlotte sat curled up in the window seat of the family sitting room, still holding the delicate lace handkerchief that had belonged to her great-grandmother. She turned it over in her small hands, examining the intricate stitching and trying to imagine the Queen as a young bride carrying this same piece of fabric on her wedding day over 70 years ago. The connection between past and present felt tangible in a way it never had before, as if she could feel the weight of history flowing through her fingertips. George stood at the same window, looking out over the gardens where he and the Queen had walked together just months earlier. The autumn light was fading, casting long shadows across the carefully maintained lawns and flower beds that his great-grandmother had loved so much. He remembered her pointing out different plants and explaining which ones attracted butterflies, her voice animated with genuine enthusiasm for the natural world that surrounded her home. Their parents found them there as darkness began to fall, both children processing their grief in their own quiet ways. William sat down beside his son while Catherine joined Charlotte on the window seat, the family drawing together naturally after a day that had required them to share their most private emotions with the entire world. "How do you feel about today?" Catherine asked softly, her arm around Charlotte's shoulders. The 7-year-old considered the question seriously, her young mind working to find words for experiences that seemed too large for ordinary vocabulary. "Sad but proud," she finally said, her voice small but clear. "Sad because Gone is gone, but proud because so many people loved her." George nodded at his sister's words, finding them more accurate than anything he might have said himself. "I didn't know there were so many people," he added. "I mean, I knew she was the queen, but I didn't really understand what that meant to everyone else." His 9-year-old perspective was beginning to grasp concepts of duty and service that extended far beyond his immediate family experience. The conversation that followed was gentle but profound, as William and Catherine helped their children begin to understand the broader significance of what they had participated in and witnessed. They talked about the Queen's 70-year reign, about the changes she had seen and guided the country through, about the constancy of her presence in people's lives across generations. "Your great-grandmother always said that being royal wasn't about being special," William explained. "It was about being useful, about serving other people and putting their needs before your own wants." Both children absorbed this lesson, understanding that the admiration they had witnessed during the day wasn't just for their great-grandmother's position, but for how she had chosen to use that position throughout her long life. Charlotte asked practical questions that revealed her developing understanding of royal responsibility. "Will we have to do things like that when we're older?" she wanted to know. "Walking in processions and having people watch us?" Catherine exchanged a look with William before answering honestly but gently. "Sometimes, yes. But you'll be older and stronger, and you'll understand better why it's important." The conversation turned to memories as the evening wore on, with both children sharing their favorite recollections of time spent with their great-grandmother. George talked about the private tea they had shared, where she had shown him portrait miniatures of long-dead kings and queens and explained how each had contributed something important to the country's story. Charlotte remembered the Queen teaching her how to properly greet foreign dignitaries, turning protocol lessons into games that made learning about royal etiquette feel like play rather than work. These personal memories helped both children begin to process their grief in a healthy way, understanding that while their great-grandmother was no longer physically present, the lesson she had taught them and the love she had shown them would remain with them always. The formal ceremonies of the day had been about public mourning and national continuity, but these quiet family conversations were about personal loss and individual growth. As bedtime approached, both children seemed reluctant to end the day, as if sleeping might somehow make their great-grandmother's death more final than it already felt. Catherine and William understood this reluctance and allowed the family time to extend longer than usual, recognizing that this was not a day to be rushed toward its conclusion. When they finally prepared for bed, Charlotte asked if she could keep the Queen's handkerchief under her pillow, while George carefully placed the antique cufflinks on his bedside table, where he could see them first thing in the morning. These tangible connections to their great-grandmother provided comfort and continuity that helped both children face the prospect of sleep after such an emotionally overwhelming day. The global response to the children's participation in the funeral had been overwhelmingly positive, though William and Catherine were careful to shield George and Charlotte from too much media attention in the immediate aftermath. Messages of admiration and support had poured in from around the world, praising the children's composure, dignity, and obvious genuine love for their great-grandmother. Royal historians noted that the children's participation marked a significant moment in the evolution of the monarchy, representing a more inclusive and family-centered approach to royal ceremonies than had been traditional in previous generations. Their presence had humanized the formal state occasion in a way that resonated particularly strongly with families watching around the world. In the days that followed, both children returned to their regular school routines, though teachers and classmates were sensitively aware that they had just participated in one of the most significant events in recent British history. The normalcy of homework and playground games provided important grounding after the intensity of the funeral, helping them integrate their extraordinary experience with their continuing childhood development. The long-term impact of September 19th, 2022, on George and Charlotte's understanding of their roles and responsibilities would unfold over years to come. But the foundation had been laid for their future service through their great-grandmother's example and through their own direct experience of what it means to serve something greater than oneself. The Queen's final gift to her great-grandchildren had been the opportunity to participate meaningfully in her farewell, to understand through direct experience the love and respect that surrounded their family, and to begin their own conscious journey toward the roles they would one day assume. Their dignified participation in her funeral procession became not just a moment of personal goodbye, but a public demonstration of the monarchy's continuing relevance and human appeal. As autumn turned toward winter at Windsor Castle, George and Charlotte continued to process their grief and their growth in the quiet ways that children do. They asked fewer questions about death and more questions about duty, about service, about what their great-grandmother would have wanted them to do with the lessons she had taught them. The handkerchief and cufflinks remained treasured possessions, tangible reminders of a woman who had shaped not just their understanding of royal responsibility, but their fundamental sense of what it meant to live a life of purpose and service. In their small hands, these artifacts represented the continuation of a legacy that stretched back centuries and would extend far into an uncertain but hopeful future. The day that had begun with two nervous children getting dressed in black had ended with two young people who had discovered reserves of strength and dignity they hadn't known they possessed. Their great-grandmother's final procession had become their first conscious step into the roles that would define their adult lives, carried forward on a foundation of love, loss, and an emerging understanding of what it truly means to serve.